Picture Athens in the spring of 2010. Riot police lined up outside Parliament. Tear gas drifting over Syntagma Square. 3 people dead after protesters firebombed a bank. And inside the finance ministry, officials were staring at a number that had just doubled overnight, not because the economy got worse overnight, but because the country finally admitted how bad things already were. That's really where this story starts. Not with a stock market crash, not with a bank run, but with a lie that eventually became too big to keep telling. Let's back up first, though, because Greece wasn't always the poster child for financial disaster. After World War II and a brutal civil war, Greece was flat broke. But between 1950 and the early 1970s, the country pulled off what historians actually call the Greek economic miracle. Growth averaged nearly 8% a year in the 1960s, second only to Japan in the entire world. Shipping, manufacturing, tourism, they all took off. Debt stayed low. For a good 3 decades, Greece looked like a genuine success story. Then in 1970, the military junta that had ruled the country collapsed, and democracy came back. And here's the detail people often skip: the new governments, both left and right, made a deliberate choice to bring ordinary Greeks, many of whom had been shut out or persecuted under the dictatorship, into the economic mainstream. They expanded public sector jobs, pensions, and social benefits. Generous policy, understandable politically, but it was funded by borrowing rather than by raising equivalent tax revenue. By the early 1990s, government debt had shot up past 90% of GDP. Then came the 2000s, and the moment that really set the trap: Greece joined the eurozone in 2001. And to qualify, a country technically has to keep its deficit and debt within certain limits. Greece's numbers didn't really meet that bar. And this is the part that later became a full-blown scandal. The Greek government, working with help from banks including Goldman Sachs, used complex currency swap deals to make its debt look smaller on paper than it actually was. Billions in loans were essentially disguised through a fictitious exchange rate trick. Technically, these swaps weren't illegal at the time under EU accounting rules, but they were absolutely designed to hide the true scale of borrowing from Brussels. Once Greece was in the Euro club, though, something interesting happened. Suddenly, Greek government bonds were treated by investors almost like German bonds. Same currency, so apparently similar risk, right? Money flooded in from banks across Europe, especially Germany and France, at cheap interest rates. Greek wages rose faster than productivity did. Imports surged. Greece was consuming way more than it was producing, and covering the gap by borrowing more and more from abroad. Between 1999 and 2009, both the trade deficit and the budget deficit tripled as a share of the economy. Meanwhile, actually collecting taxes remained a serious national weakness. A huge slice of the economy, something like a quarter of it, operated in cash, off the books. Self-employment was double the European average, and self-employment happens to correlate strongly with tax evasion. Add to that heavy military spending. Greece was Europe's biggest arms importer in 2008, largely because of tension with Turkey, and you had a government spending far beyond what it was honestly bringing in. So that was the setup. Here's the trigger. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit, and it hit shipping and tourism, 2 of Greece's biggest earners, especially hard. Revenue from both fell about 15% in a single year. Credit that had been flowing freely into peripheral European countries like Greece suddenly dried up as banks everywhere got nervous and pulled back. Then in October 2009, a newly elected government came in and did something that, on paper, sounds responsible. It told the truth. The outgoing government had projected a budget deficit for 2009 of around 6 to 8% of GDP. The real number, once properly counted, turned out to be over 15%, more than double. It later came out that Greece had been misreporting its fiscal data to European statisticians for years, receiving formal reservations from Eurostat on 5 separate occasions since 2004. That revelation was the spark. Investors who'd been lending to Greece at German-level interest rates suddenly asked, "Wait, what else don't we know?" Bond yields spiked. Rating agencies downgraded Greek debt to junk status in April 2010. And just like that, Greece couldn't borrow on private markets anymore at any price it could afford. Now here's the part that made Greece's situation genuinely different from, say, a country like Iceland or Argentina defaulting. Normally when a country in this position gets into trouble, it can devalue its own currency, make its exports cheaper, make its debt easier to inflate away, and gradually claw back competitiveness. Greece couldn't do that. It had given up the drachma for the euro, and monetary policy was now set in Frankfurt, not Athens, for the entire eurozone, not just for Greece's problems. So instead of currency devaluation, Greece was forced into what economists call internal devaluation. Basically, cutting wages, pensions, and prices directly, the hard way, instead of doing it indirectly through a weaker currency. Private sector wages fell nearly 20% between 2010 and 2014. That's brutal, and it's also self-defeating in a specific way. When you cut people's incomes that hard, tax revenue falls too, which makes the debt burden, measured against a shrinking economy, look even worse. In May 2010, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, together nicknamed the Troika, stepped in with the first bailout, €110 billion, in exchange for austerity measures and structural reforms. It wasn't enough. The recession deepened faster than anyone predicted. So in 2011, private banks holding Greek bonds agreed to take a loss, eventually a reduction of more than 50% on the face value of their bonds, one of the largest debt write-downs in modern history. Then came a second bailout in 2012, worth €130 billion. 12 separate rounds of tax hikes and spending cuts rolled out between 2010 and 2016. VAT went up. Pensions were slashed. Public sector jobs disappeared by the tens of thousands. And the human cost was severe. Unemployment, which had been below 10% before the crisis, climbed to nearly 28% by 2013. Youth unemployment at one point passed 60%. GDP shrank by roughly a quarter between 2009 and 2014, one of the deepest peacetime economic contractions any developed country has ever recorded. Suicide attempts rose sharply. Homelessness spiked. By some estimates, a third of the population was living below the poverty line by 2016. By January 2015, Greeks were furious, and they elected Syriza, a left-wing party led by Alexis Tsipras that promised to reject further austerity. Negotiations with creditors broke down completely that summer. Banks shut their doors for weeks. ATM withdrawals were capped. On July 5, 2015, Tsipras called a referendum, and 61% of Greeks voted to reject the bailout terms being offered. And then, in one of the more jarring political reversals of the whole crisis, Tsipras turned around days later and accepted a third bailout anyway, one that was arguably tougher than what voters had just rejected, because the alternative was crashing out of the euro entirely, something most Greeks, despite their anger, didn't actually want. On June 30, 2015, Greece missed a loan repayment to the IMF, becoming the first developed country ever to do that. It paid 20 days late. Greece formally exited its bailout programs in August 2018, after 9 years under some form of troika supervision. But exiting the program didn't mean the debt vanished. It stood at close to 180% of GDP at various points, among the highest of any nation on Earth. Creditors extended repayment periods and lowered interest rates to make that mountain of debt more manageable over decades rather than years. So what does Greece actually look like today, in 2026? Genuinely, quite different from the darkest years of the crisis. The debt-to-GDP ratio has been falling fast, down from a peak of around 210% in 2020 to roughly 145% now, still high, still the highest in the European Union, but the fastest declining in the world according to Greece's own finance minister. The government has been running consistent primary surpluses, meaning it collects more than it spends before interest payments, and it's been repaying old bailout loans years ahead of schedule. Unemployment, which peaked near 28%, is now down around 7 to 9%, the lowest since before the crisis even began. Tourism is booming. Shipping remains a global powerhouse. Credit rating agencies have upgraded Greek bonds well out of junk territory, and in 2025 international index provider FTSE Russell even began reclassifying Greece's stock market back into developed market status, more than a decade after it had been the first developed country ever downgraded to emerging market status. It's not all smooth sailing. Energy prices and global instability have been squeezing growth in 2026, inflation ticked back up, and huge structural problems remain, an economy still overly dependent on tourism, a lingering tax evasion culture, and a debt load that, even after all this progress, remains one of the heaviest in the developed world. But compared to the years when riot police faced down protesters outside a parliament that had just discovered its own government had been lying about the numbers, Greece today looks like a country that has genuinely clawed its way back from the edge. The crisis reshaped Greek politics permanently too. The two parties that had traded power for nearly 40 years, New Democracy and PASOK, both collapsed in public trust, giving rise to new political forces and a far more fragmented parliament than Greece had ever known. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in this whole story. A currency union without a fiscal union creates a strange kind of trap. You can borrow like a rich country during the good years, but when the crisis hits, you can't devalue your way out like a normal country would. Someone still has to absorb the pain. In Greece's case, for nearly a decade, that someone was ordinary people, and the country is still paying down both the debt and the cost of what that decade did to an entire generation.